Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is of course a show where we take little dives into weird, peculiar, unusual albums that are out there, We're kind of covering all sorts of different things, I feel, getting a nice mix of different stuff. And today I want to dive back into something we have talked briefly about on this show. So today we're talking about an album that has cemented itself as one of the most important albums within the experimental and minimalist genre out there. And it's one that, for better or for worse, technically spearheaded an entire genre movement within its own right. I find it truly fascinating, but it's also a fascinating album in its own right as well. So of course today we are talking about Forms of Paper by Steve Roden. So of course, let's ask ourselves the question, who is Steve Roden? Well, Steve Roden is an American sound and visual artist whose work delves deep into ambient minimalism, taking quiet, unheard sounds and amplifying them to perform these really complex soundscapes. And I have to say, there's a wonderful experimental approach to Roden's music that really pushes the boundaries of minimalism itself into this very peculiar place. Accenting the silent and quiet sounds buried deep within recordings themselves. And in today's episode, we're looking at that 2001 record, Forms of Paper, an album that, through no fault of Roden, ended up launching an entire genre of minimalist music known today as lowercase. So, before we talk about Forms of Paper, let us ask ourselves another question. What is lowercase? Well, lowercase is a very peculiar genre of music that was popularised by the very release of Forms of Paper. And generally speaking, lowercase music is seen these days as an extreme form of ambient minimalism, where very quiet, unheard sounds are amplified to more extreme levels. And the term has been used by Roden to describe his work for many, many years, with him stating himself that it bears a certain sense of quiet and humility. It doesn't draw attention. It must be discovered. It's the opposite of capital letters, loud things which draw attention to themselves. And whilst many albums can be attributed to helping popularise lowercase music, such as the works of Richard Charter and Bernard Gunther, it was the release of Forms of Paper that actually saw the term, becoming more widely used. Mostly in part, due to an interview with Steve Roden in '97 by Rob Young for The Wire, where Roden mentioned that his artistic tendencies were lowercase. And using the term, he used the term to set apart his own works from the more bombastic works that he saw around him at the time. And as well, after the article's release though, Roden described the term as no longer being his own though, as it then started, being adopted by artists within the experimental music scene who, in his words, found sympathy with the term. And from there, like many, genres that have occurred this way, it just grew and turned into its own thing entirely. Now, I would say it's a very similar story to how the term post-rock was popularised in an article covering the debut album by Bark Psychosis. And then from there, the term was established and it, grew into its own definitive genre. But getting back to Forms of Paper, let's talk a bit about this. The production of this album began with the exhibition 6 Degrees, Art in the Libraries, which was a group exhibition of site-specific works for public libraries around Los Angeles. And by electronically manipulating the sounds of book pages being rubbed, scraped, turned, etc., Roden produced this incredibly immersive minimalist album experience that sees emphasis of tiny, minute actions, the very careful handling of paper, and then amplifying it to more audible levels. And the Sound Art project saw Roden using 8 speakers, placing them on small pedestals around the library, alongside series of paper drawings made from discarded books. And then this piece was played into the library space continuously for a whole month, performed at, almost quite inaudible levels. And I don't know about you, but for me, I find the process truly fascinating, And, the released version of this album, the Forms of Paper album that we're looking at today, it gives us an insight into that very experience itself, Listening to Forms of Paper places us right there in the library itself, right between even the very pages themselves being rustled and interacted with. And I find it fascinating. It's so interesting how microsounds as a genre, it ends up placing you right in the epicenter of the very sounds being produced, making them feel so much bigger and grander and more massive than they were to begin with. And as well, this album itself, it's a very peculiar one that gently simmers along, it proceeds at such a slow, patient pace, It amplifies the slightest of touches that produce the most peculiar sensations in our ears as we, listen to it and experience it. And it starts off so incredibly quiet, There is almost nothing there to begin with. You really have to start patiently with this album before you get this myriad of sounds start to make their way into the mix, Sounding kind of like gently simmering high frequencies, if that makes sense. And then as it progresses along, you get faint crackles, hisses, and it really helps envision, the feeling of paper itself, in the album itself. And it's weird though, it feels almost like a quintessential ambient album experience at times, you even do get these drones, electronic warbles and whatnot, but the entire production of this album being sourced from the handling of paper, it just makes it a truly fascinating listening experience. And it's amazing how, there's some amazing microsound and lowercase albums out there, but it's easy to see why this one in particular has ended up becoming one of the most well-known and most beloved within the very genre itself. So, alongside the original 2001 album release of Forms of Paper, released on none other than Richard Chartier's record label Line at its 7th official release, we were then offered a remastered version of the album in 2011, which was lovingly remastered by the one and only Bernard Guntier, who sought to create something much more akin to Roden's original vision, arguably. And then this re-release, which is also available online in print Bandcamp page, it comes with this accompanying 8-page essay by Roden himself, titled On Lowercase Affinities and Forms of Paper. And this fascinating read delves deep into Roden's understanding of his own creative notions, the art piece itself, Forms of Paper, and the greater impact it's had upon the world itself and, the world of music and lowercase music. And it's fascinating though. It gives us such an insight into the album itself, and what I find amusing is it reveals Roden to have been almost baffled and confused by the reception this album got, especially in terms of spearheading that very genre itself that he never meant to establish in the first place. But what I love as well, you read this, there's this really quiet humility to the words he says himself, He's almost apologising for starting off the lowercase genre, which, in his words, he never intended to happen. And as well, you even get some discussion on his actual processes themselves, especially in discovering the capabilities of the computer as a form of composition, which greatly helped the production of Forms of Paper. Now, it's definitely worth taking time to read this if you want to learn a little bit more about this, truly fascinating and unique album. And so, I think with this, we're going to be coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. It's truly fascinating. We have touched upon lowercase music, arguably. We discussed Decisive Forms by Richard Chartier, and there's more lowercase albums I'd like to talk about, but it's very important to talk about Forms of Paper, I would argue, considering that, especially for me, this is an album that introduced me to the lowercase genre itself. It introduced me to to Richard Charter, to Line Imprint, and it just branched off into this truly wonderful world of discovery in this really eclectic genre. Like, I'm very grateful for it, and plus, as well, Forms of Paper is this truly fascinating album in its own right. And it's like I wrote here, like, it would be so remiss of me to have not covered Forms of Paper on this channel, considering how influential it's been, how important it is to the genre, and just how fascinating it is, And it really opened up so much for me. Like, yeah, I've sort of like gained this real appreciation for these peculiar sound art performances that you get within lowercase music, As well, though, it's not just Forms of Paper. Roden actually has a fascinating body of work out there available to listen to on his Bandcamp, with there being so many albums that are worth checking out, though. So, if you are intrigued by Forms of Paper, have a listen to it, and then listen to more of Roden's work. They're truly fascinating artistic processes, I would say. But yeah, with that, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Weird Music, I wish you all the best. I hope you take care. All the best, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye now.